Okay, welcome to the Friday Transportation Seminar at Portland State University. Today we are pretty honored to have Robert McCullough. Okay, so I'm not to blame. Robert is one of the members that produced a report for the City Club, Portland City Club on bicycling, and he is also a adjunct professor at Portland State University. Today he will talk on the topic of whether Portland bicycling has reached its top of the logistic curve. Okay, with that, I will turn over to Robert.
Thank you very much. Anyone who's active in local civic affairs is going to be interested in active transportation. One of the challenges traditionally has been that we don't really have any data, but that changed on August 8th. So it's a very exciting period. Part of the excitement is also that Portland State knows more about bicycling than everyone else put together in the world. And I'm not kidding. We did an extensive bibliographic exercise. That's what the City Club Research Committees really are good at, is bibliographies. And there isn't one. But we have very good research being done here. So I was very proud that the university that I'm affiliated with was the best in the land. So under City Club rules, I was not able to give a report on the statistics while it was being evaluated. So the City Club goes through an extensive process of fact-checking and then a vote to approve the report, et cetera. So you get embargoed, and that embargo ended up in the summer. So the report I'm giving you today, I really should have given you about 6 months ago. But the good news is now I have 6 months more data. So the question that he was trying to answer was, how does the guy with the long name that you can't pronounce and is misspelled show up here? I'm an energy economist. I have a master's from Portland State. I have an unfinished doctorate from Cornell. Yes, if any of you are in that stage, do not take a job. Listen to your advisor. You will feel bad about it 40 years later. I'm best known for my work on Enron. It was my testimony at the U.S. Senate that launched the Enron trading investigation. And so if you're walking by my car while I'm turning it on, duck just to be careful. There are still some criminals wandering around Portland that bear me a grudge. Good news is bicycling is far less dangerous. You'll notice I took the nice picture of an antique bicycle and then drew a red line on it. Because one of the ironies is that that is a logistic curve. Now, I'm not going to read that paper. I've actually sat in a lecture hall while people have read their paper. This is very hard work. What I'm going to do is show the graphics and talk around them. All of our data is available. If someone wants to pick this up as a master's project, everything we have is yours. And it'll save you a pain in the ass of dealing with some bulky people at the city and metro. So everything, and believe me, bulky is the word. We had to poke the metro guys about 4 times before we got our data set out of them. So the bottom line is ask questions, don't feel embarrassed. Whatever agendas here are very obvious. I'm having fun playing with the data. Okay, peak pedaling. Obviously, I grabbed this from the old peak oil concept, which, by the way, just in case everyone's paying attention, who is the largest oil producer in the world? We are. And that sort of puts a big hole in the peak oil process. Well, hopefully we will put a hole in the peak pedaling process too. Increasing evidence that our commuting is leveling off downtown. Now, one of the bizarre parts of the U.S. is those of you who commuted to school today, the census does not think you commuted to school today. So our survey data has some huge holes in it. Second, the survey data is just that. And the surveys have a lot of area for error. Not the craziest one is the following. If you ask teenagers whether they're having sex, what is the answer? Yes. Even those of us who were geeks in high school would have said yes, because we've been embarrassed to say no. If you ask people, are they bicycling to work, the answer is yes, because they don't want to admit that they overslept and drove their car. So we do tend to get a lot of noise in that data. But the good thing is we now have the Hawthorne Bridge, and we have daily and hourly data on the Hawthorne Bridge, and we now have over a year of it. And that is a hell of an advantage from what we've ever had before. And we're accumulating it at a heady state. My regressions had 450 degrees of freedom. You can actually do statistics with 450 degrees of freedom. So the next thing is weather, weekend, sunset variables, highly significant. Now, economists have terrible data sets. And for an economist to have a simple regression model that's significant at 99% is very unusual. Having an R-squared of 80%, we just don't get this stuff. So one of the nice things about bicycle commuters is they're incredibly predictable. They tend to like the same routes. They tend to have pretty strong habits. Most people did not bicycle to downtown jobs today because we know that when it's cold and precipitation, it falls off rapidly. So in terms of the data set, it's a very clean data set. And last, the policy implications. I had a nice interview with the Mercury the other day, and the Mercury loves me because I took on the vegan strippers. And you know, economist stuff is dull, but vegan strippers, that's a big deal. So there was a strip joint trying to get set up next to a school, and I was one of the people who spoke against it. So the bottom line is policy has changed. We've been trying 100 different ways of creating bicycle commuters. Most of them turn out not to work very well. And the time for paint is past. Now is the time for solid planning. Roger Geller and I, who agree on absolutely nothing other than the fact that he's really smart, I think he might agree with that, agree with the fact that we are now in a situation where we're going to have to do careful planning to get safe paths if we're going to increase bicycle commuting. And it's demonstrated right here. Let's take a look at our demographics. We have my old friend Duncan Carter, who bicycles, who is not a spring chicken. But if you look around, there aren't many people who are not spring chickens. We have a demographic for bicycling that favors males, it favors young over old, it favors affluent over non-affluent. To get the rest of the community, we have to find safer paths. And so that's really our policy challenge from now on. So, the City Hall numbers have traditionally been a mixture of measurement and survey. The survey is volunteer, not a solid way to do it. But even the Hawthorne Bridge, which is theoretically measured, has not actually been fitting our real data all that well. They've never been very clear on their methodology. It apparently is a subset of summer days, midweek, perhaps the peak 2 hours. I see someone nodding. Good, you may know vastly more about this than I. And that's not, there's nothing wrong about it. There's nothing dishonest about it. But it's planning data. It's not very good planning data. And I just put our monthly numbers, real life data up here. And then across it, you'll see what we got in the Portland rides. Oh yeah, she advised me to do this for the mouse, so I'll go do that. So what we're seeing here is even our peak doesn't look very much like the reports we're getting. Now, what does this mean? It means that data is king. If you try to plan without data, you don't get anywhere. The head of the sustainability group here has this nice phrase that I'll massacre, which is policy without planning, planning without data. And so we are really lucky to start having a good solid flow of data. Now, early on in the City Club report, I noted that intuitively the data we were seeing from both the survey data downtown from the Portland Business Group plus the city tended to look like a logistic curve. Logistic curves are generally marketing tools. We use them for everything from Indian casinos to new products like iPhones. And basically the theory is almost trivial. Early adopters start off slow, everyone catches on, very rapid exponential growth, then we saturate the target demographic. And so it seems that we may actually be approaching that here. Here are two data sets. The first one is the Portland bicycle count. By the way, I halved it because when you look at the hourly data, people who come west in the morning go back east in the afternoon. And then we have the survey results from the downtown business census. Now, I recommend the business census very highly as surveys go because they actually have a staffer who calls the people who do not respond. It's a small enough group. So they get up between 15 and 20% response, which for surveys is amazingly good. And I was pleased to see that the basic answers of rapid growth in the last decade are the same in both surveys. Now, you may wonder why the Portland bicycle count from the Hawthorne Bridge is lower than the number of reported commuters, and that's because we have 4 major bridges. And, of course, we have north and south along the west side. But nonetheless, both data sets tend to be a bit more credible because they do agree pretty well. They have a fairly high R-squared between them. So I actually applied the standard logistic model to each of the data sets. The bicycle commuters look straight out of a textbook. We could walk over a couple of blocks to a marketing class, show them that logistic curve, and everyone would be very impressed. The commuting data is a little less of a, the Hawthorne Bridge rider is a little bit less of a classic logistic curve. In terms of significance, the Downtown Business Alliance is significant at 99%. The Hawthorne Bridge data is significant at 95%. Now, what's wrong with this analysis? Well, quite frankly, we have no degrees of freedom. It is a very restrictive model. We have a survey once a year, which is a terrible thing to do on something that's both diurnal and seasonal. And I wish we had more frequent surveys coming out of the city. And frankly, if I was one of you, I would descend on Roger Geller and say, I will not let go of you until you give me every last data point you've ever seen. And that would make a hell of a good thesis. Unfortunately, in the moment, what we get from his group is just once a year. However, we do have our new data set, and I am very pleased with it. This comes off the web. You can actually go off to the web and see the ridership. I clipped off the dates at the moment because they became too dense. But basically, this is Christmas of last year. And guess what this one is? The one that goes off the top. Oh, come on, guys, you know it. Some of you were there. Yeah, the nudies. Yeah, and the nudies are awesome. And imagine for a moment collecting 10,000 naked people in one place. I mean, this, as an organizational issue, it's just brilliant. Unfortunately, they are some of the sorriest looking naked people I've ever seen. So let me talk to you a little bit about basic econometric modeling. There have been studies that show that most of the models that we report in the journals don't stand up over time. And the problem is not that the world changed. The problem is that it is very honest to be a careful specifier of an econometric model. And here's the usual example. We all start with a prior. And my prior in this case was weather, time of the year, day, night, weekend are all going to affect bicycle ridership. It's a pretty clear prior. And luckily, it turned out right. However, there are 100 ways to ask that question. I could have used logs. I could have used some fancy statistical method. I could have done Garch. How many people parlez-vous Garch? Okay, excellent tool. When you see someone going that far out on the statistical expertise, you wonder how many preliminary specifications he abandoned. The love of my life is in the back row, and she said to me the other day, I see in the Oregonian that peanut butter reduces breast cancer. And I gave her this really ugly look, because the fact is that was not the first specification in the data set. The first specification in the data set was obviously steak or hamburger or McDonald's, and they walked all the way down to peanut butter. By the time you've tried all those alternative specifications, you almost necessarily are going to get a significant result. So from the start of this, I was very sparing on the specification. We only made one major change in the entire, now, 14-month history. So this is actually a pretty honest model. And furthermore, it is a very, very simple model, which is another issue. First thing is R square of 82. As I said, for an economist, this is like heaven. If we were doing bond returns or energy demand, we'd never get anything that's good. Number two, the significance is a little high there. E to the minus 167th, that's a lot of zeros. In other words, we've met the standards for having a reasonable statistical result. On the temperature mean, people like warm weather. Surprise. People do not like precipitation. We were a little surprised that people are largely unaffected by wind. The wind results were not significant. So apparently, a little breeze doesn't bother anyone. In fact, apparently people don't say, I want to commute this morning because it's breezy either. One issue that was brought up late in the study was sunset. We noticed a very strong seasonal connection. And I didn't actually like the seasonal connection very much because I wanted to track the season back to fundamentals. And so one of the most committed bicyclists said, well, that's obvious. Nobody wants to bicycle in the dark. Well, it turns out that's true. People stop commuting when the sunset gets earlier in the day. And again, I would argue that's a simple safety issue. Many riders find that a scary time to bicycle because they're afraid people can't see them. Now, I noticed that because of the brilliant PowerPoint expertise of your presenter, we cut off the last one, which is embarrassing, but it's in the handouts, and that is the date. We applied a date variable, adding 1 day for each day. So the first day of the data set, August 8th, 2012, was date 1, then 2, then 3. Now this is a fairly simple way of asking, are the bicycling commuters increasing or decreasing over this period? I had expected a priori to find a positive number, though a small one. When I looked at those curves I showed you a moment before, they looked like they were leveling out, but they certainly didn't look like they were at the top. But what we ended up with was a very small negative number that is not at all significant. We cannot reject the hypothesis that we are reaching the level top of the logistic curve. And that's pretty interesting news. What it says to us is that minor policy steps are probably not what we need to do next. And while we were working on this, I took this over and we made a similar presentation to Roger Geller and his group at the city. He came out with his own paper, entirely different methodology, working back on how he thought we could meet the city's 2030 objectives. And his conclusions are exactly the same, that we need bicycle boulevards, not intermediate steps. And I was very pleased by that because this is speculative. Literally, as appalling as it is, this is the first time the City Club of Portland has ever had statistical evidence in one of their reports. But even worse, other than a couple of studies at Portland State, this is the first time anyone has been doing this sort of nuts and bolts data monging. I'd like to say it's brilliant. It isn't. It's necessary. It's useful. We do it everywhere else. But we're now sitting in the room of the people who have done more of this than the rest of the world. Even those of you who have never done it before today are well up on the rest of the world. So even the Europeans have very little in the way of published studies and statistics. They have a lot more bicyclists, but apparently they don't count them very well. So how does our model look in terms of prediction? The red is actual rides. The blue is predicted rides. Now, this is Christmas. How many people said to their families on Christmas, I really want a bicycle today, just save the turkey? The model did not know about holidays other than to put in a dummy variable for Christmas, but the fact is the model does very poorly on special days like that. And that tends to give us a modeling bias for a higher ridership during the winter than we would otherwise. Our Thanksgiving and Christmas holidays, and in fact the week around them, tend to be predicted high. And that doesn't surprise me much. It's just one of many extensions to the model as we get more data that we would like to look to. There are a couple that are more important, though, and I thought about putting up a lot of slides on them, but I just want to address them. I used two variables to describe the impact of temperature, the impact of precipitation, the impact of wind. I used temperature and temperature squared. Now, part of that is because we have no a priori evidence that it's a linear relationship. Without the second variable, we're imposing a model that says that you like to bicycle just a little bit more every time the temperature goes up. Now, we know that's a very bad model. In fact, the model we would expect to see would be at least the third order polynomial. We would expect to see the ridership go to 0 at a certain temperature, like today, and also go to 0 at a very high temperature, say 100. So we resisted, actually I resisted, the temptation to fiddle on the theory that I would wait until we had a big enough data set to play with it and play with it honestly. Now, believe me, I looked everywhere in terms of JSTOR, Google Docs, Google Scholar, for someone who had actually done these specifications before, and I couldn't find them. Isn't that amazing? If we were talking about the demand for refrigerators, I could give you 100 scholarly articles. I don't even want to buy a refrigerator. So there's a lot of interesting research left to be done here. And because I am sort of a gnarly guy, I'll probably be back in a year, if you'll have me, when we have another tranche of data and test that prior, that we would have a shape that goes vertical at low temperatures, then another logistic curve, and then vertical at very high temperatures. So if you're here next year, you can find out whether my prior was honest. By the way, most researchers are not that honest. They will not tell you what they think they'll find before they go test it. So if I'm dead wrong, you'll have some fun with me a year from now. Okay, so let's talk about the next policy issue. Are things really growing? Well, this is the 2 years put side by side with a caveat. Number one, some of you will notice that we've not seen December 2013 yet. That's a forecasted data set. And as you would expect, it looks high compared to our actual data last year. Again, that's the holiday ridership issue. Also, there was some data from the city for the first part of last year, which I've used in this. But for a reason I have not found out, there's a gap in July. So I also interpolated that data from the model. So this is not a completely up-and-up comparison. But what it's showing is that we seem to have some lower ridership in the summer months, and I'm a little surprised by that. Even our 10,000 count on the Naked Bicycle Day did not really switch those results much. Intuitively, this looks to me like sort of a draw. And there are 100 different ways to draw that data, and I welcome people to try every different way. But I think the fact is we're pretty much even from last year. So what's the next step? Well, Mr. Leclerc, who has a master's from Portland State 10 years ago, did a great master's thesis, which I believe I am the only person to have ever praised. I hope he has a committee member somewhere who said he was brilliant. And he asked the question, can I look at the relationship between commuting and infrastructure? That's a desperately important thing to do. We managed to get some of the data out of Metro. I had to go, by the way, all the way up to Tom Hughes eventually to have him hurl lightning bolts down to their data department, who kept saying, well, who is the City Club and why would we help you? And he kindly enough cleared out that unfortunate question. Metro should know who the City Club is after 100 years. And so we did get a good data set. We do not have enough data set to approach causality, and I'm going to talk about causality in a minute. But correlation is a good first step. Now what Leclerc did is he took each of his census districts and then used a wide variety of variables to try to explain where the bicyclists are. And he used miles to the central business district, mean slope, and a variety of others. If I was going to criticize the earlier study, which of course I will just for the fun of it, was he had too many explanatory variables. And again, that's awful tempting when you're working with data like that. We tried to be more restrictive. We did 2 regressions. Again, this issue about being very careful not to overspecify. The first one was using each of the infrastructure types identified at Metro in the city. Then we also had some geographic variables following Mr. Leclerc's model. And finally, we added 1 or 2 demographic materials, in this case, age. We could have done a lot more on the demographics, and I just was a little worried about pushing it too hard. We don't have enough data. We only have 100 and some census districts. So this is not an extensive data set. However, the basic results are again very good. The significance has a lot of zeros. You should always feel good about that. The significant variables are the ones I've kept in the regression. And basically, it follows what we would think to occur. Commuting falls as we get further from the central commuting destination. The average mean slope is a downer. I'll tell you, for those of us who lived in Reed College, there's a big hill right in front of Reed College, which is quite a downer. And when I was a Reed College student, however, I would walk up the hill with a bicycle and then ride down it dangerously at 3 in the morning, sometimes under the influence of things that are only legal in Washington. So, so much for my political career. Age, it's a downer. This is, by the way, a real policy issue here. Portland is both more affluent and older than most U.S. cities. It's also much whiter than most U.S. cities. Minorities tend to have a much smaller role in bicycling than whites. I've heard a lot of explanations on this. Some of it, frankly, is some of my black friends say that people, they just fear that exposure. I don't know whether that's true. So I wanted to go through all of those possibilities, but the fact of the matter, with 100 and some data points, it just isn't going to be real. So one of the issues when we get more data is it'd be fun to actually look at the demographics more. On the linear feet of Bike Boulevard, very, very good. And the linear feet of low traffic through street, very, very good. And that really underscores the safety message. On the paint on the pavement, that dropped out of the regression immediately. Totally insignificant. And that just makes so much sense to me. We have strong bicyclists who will adventure anywhere. And then we have ma and pa who are not going to get onto a busy street regardless of some imaginary line painted down the middle of it. And we're having a policy debate in my neck of the woods at the moment. Someone wanted to put a bike path along the golf course. Very beautiful path, great idea. Zero visibility, very scary to everyone. And traditionally, few people have bicycled down that simply because somebody coming along at 30 or 40 miles an hour could easily swipe you. So if we want to get those sort of routes, we have to make a serious investment to make sure they're safe. So I was told that I only have 45 minutes, and look at this. And once you teach college once or twice, you learn when to stop. Yeah.
The role of petroleum prices seems like it may be something that affects ridership. Or do I need that?
You're entirely correct.
So did you notice it daily fluctuations or annual fluctuations in petroleum prices as something that affected ridership?
I did look at that in some care, and again, we're time series, so we don't have much of a picture. I was surprised to see how little retail was having an impact on it. It was not statistically significant, but part of my problem is the following. There just isn't a lot of data there. And I think that that should have a lot of impact. I also think the unemployment rate should have a lot of impact. Traditionally, the answer is that most young people, the first thing they do after getting a full-time permanent job is buy a car. And whether that's going to be true in the future, that's just where we've been for 100 years, well, for 50 years. So I would have expected more of an impact, but I can't say our data set's very good. Ma'am?
Hi.
You don't think of yourself as ma'am because you're too young, I know, but
Okay.
that's respectful for those of us who grew up in Chicago.
Thank you. My question is on destiny, and you mentioned about minority.
I cannot hear the question.
You mentioned about minorities, the bicycling thing, and I noticed there's a lot of, barriers to that factor. So is this also going to be considered in your data as time goes by? Because a person like me, I also want to, start riding bicycle stuff, but sometimes you look at it like, how is it, how is that going to be like, especially in a population where it's hard to see those things. So are there policy to, consider this into your data?
Well, I'm very interested in it. I think that's a very interesting question. We would believe, she's asking whether we're going to add the demographic variables, specifically ones pertaining to minorities, into the study. I think that's a fascinating question. Now, the time series, of course, we don't have a way of determining who those people are. But in terms of our cross-sectional, once we are able to do this for numerous years and do a pooled time series cross-sectional, I'd like to see it. My belief, my a priori belief is that we will see a dramatic difference in the data as time goes on in two ways. One, this hypothesis that urban blacks fear exposure or harassment or whatever, I don't really believe it. I think that Portland is actually a better than average environment for that, and I think if that exists, it'll go away. Now, maybe I'm idealistic, but that's what I believe. On the male-female issue, I tend to believe that will erode over time, and we'll get those two back into balance. At the moment, it's 2-to-1 male to female. On the age issue, I expect that variable to stay the same. So these are very interesting questions. I see someone in the back row.
Thanks for your presentation. It's cool to see some of this data. I was just going to encourage you to check out the work of Professor Greg Lindsay at the University of Minnesota, if you haven't already. He's done a lot of this exact same sort of work
good.
in terms
Well,
of...
that only proves that I don't do as good on Google searches as I thought.
Well, he used to be a professor in Indianapolis and did a bunch of different research along trails like the Monon Trail in Indianapolis, and has some really interesting, both not only on specific like day-to-day using their counters over the course of a couple of years, but also which part of the trails had different numbers. And he actually goes into some of the demographic of census stuff. And larger census tracts that had larger percentages of communities of color actually did have lower participation on those trails. He's written a couple, like I think maybe like 4 or 5 like peer-reviewed papers. I think most of them are in Journal of APA and some other places. I can send you the information afterwards. But
Please do, because this is very fascinating stuff. I am out of business cards. That proves what a bad consultant I am. But the person next to you will write down my email address for you.
Thanks.
I talked to some of my staff to come join us today. Sir. That was you, sir. She gave me the same look on ma'am. It's okay.
I'm just wondering about my name is Ilya. Just wait for it. My name is Ilya Soloyev. I'm interested in coming back to the actual graph versus predicted rise in the Hawthorne Bridge. It seems that it's pretty spot on through the most of the year. It's just the winter is kind of the predicted rise kind of not exactly correlate with that. And you have spoken about the temperature. So is it not included, right, in the graph? Or
Well, I'm hypothesizing that it's the holidays because it seems to cluster right around Christmas. But as I said, our temperature model is very simple. Remember, when I started, I only had 100 data points. And the idea of throwing in any more options, any more specifications was just scary. But now that we're up to 500, I think we're 450 at the moment, we can expand that. But the one thing I don't want to do is clobber our very delicate growing data set with a lot of different specifications. I'd rather wait until we get a tranche more data before we get in. You know, it is so irritating as an economist. I've done a huge amount of work on oil and speculation. And I came across someone the other day who had a Garch model that proved that there was a periodicity of 13 days in world oil markets. And I've got to tell you, that is simply bad scholarship. There is nothing on the number 13 that works well into our mercantile environment because we're still operating on a 7-day cycle, a 30-day cycle. And most of all, the primary issue in world oil markets is when the markets close, about the 3rd week of the month. So when you have a delicate new data set like this, you're inclined not to want to clobber it too early. It's like waiting for a plant to grow before you eat it. Sir.
Yeah, I kind of have a technical question, because it seems that the hypothesis here is that you're leading to is that we're sort of asymptotically limited right now on the number of bicycle riders. Though I look at your data and I don't see, all of these are wonderful corrections to the daily variability, but I don't see any variable here that tests the trend. Which
that was because the idiot who pasted the regression onto the PowerPoint, that was me, cut it off at the bottom. Let me just walk over to you. It's the one order. And as I said, the order is simply the number of days since the start of the data set. Again, not rocket science.
Okay, and basically what you're saying here is that there's just no trend at all.
Right.
Okay, it's all right.
Please. I'm afraid to say the word ma'am again after this young woman looked right and left to see who I was talking to.
That's fine. Well, I'm very excited about the work you're doing. We've been looking at this data also here at Portland State for the Hawthorne Bridge, and there's also some data at the I-205 bridge that ODOT has been collecting, and I'm wondering if you've looked at that. But I've got a few other comments. So I did my dissertation on a very similar topic in Colorado, and we also found that wind was not significant, which is amazing because they have some serious windstorms there.
Yes.
And we had temperature and so forth in it. But we ended up using a little bit more basic model. So my question is, and there's been some great work at McGill in Montreal on this topic as well, and they have much more data than we have here in Portland to do this kind of work. But one of the things they found was that looking at the lag of temperature, so the temperature the day before and that sort of thing is also important. So in the future, do you have plans to look at that?
Well, I didn't put up the slides for the hourly data, and we did get the hourly data from the city. And one of the questions I had, but I felt limited by the limited data set, was how people determine how cold it is, because obviously they're going to determine that by looking at their Google or their TV before they set out. So I would have expected to see the weather forecast from 7 a.m. driving it. But then, of course, we run into a couple of other data problems, which is the weather forecasts are different in different areas of the city, and I had no way to know where they were coming from. So I punted on it, but I would certainly agree that it is a very good hypothesis. I punted on a lot, by the way. I have to be honest here. Sir?
So in looking at some of your conclusions, please correct me if I'm wrong, it seems to me you say a big reason why we are potentially at the top of this curve is primarily due to questions of safety or perceptions of safety and the lack of dedicated separate bicycle infrastructure for that.
I think that's what I believe. I'm not sure I can prove it, but the evidence seems to be leading down that path.
Okay, well, yeah, I was really curious because, like, in looking at least that earlier regression from that master's thesis, there's actually a very weak, even though it's highly significant, a very weak link between, that kind of specific kind of bicycle infrastructure. And I'm curious if the question really is like that itself, as opposed to as opposed to some kind of greater land use change overall, especially if you're using CBD as your target. Like those trips are going to drop monotonically with distance. So it seemed that maybe balancing housing and workplaces, as opposed to putting in new dedicated infrastructure, new bike boulevards, could potentially be like a much more effective, although longer term means.
You are so right. And when the Metro transportation survey came out last spring, I descended upon them like a pack of wolves, and I worried it out of them immediately. Because I was hoping we'd have a big enough data set to deal with the fact that home business is growing very rapidly. My business for a while, and my journey to work is 3 blocks, and I don't often go to work because of the internet. However, the individual responses in that early data set are very limited, and you could identify neighborhoods, you could identify census tracts, but I was appalled how quickly it fell off. The other problem with the survey had to do with the people here. How many people have a landline? Yeah, okay, and look at the color of the hair of the people who have the landline.
I have there, sure.
And so it turned out that there was a pretty strong bias in the data against younger people because we don't have a phone book for cell phones. And they tried hard to fix it, but we really don't have an answer yet on the survey data. So if you did the usual demographic pyramid, if it's no longer a pyramid, but the barbell, it turns out that the census thinks there's a lot more young people in Portland than their survey did. So on the bicycle variable, it got very thin on the neighborhoods. Again, when we can start doing full time series cross-sectional, we can apply to some of the fact that we just don't have many numbers. But yeah, you have hit exactly the question I was most interested in.
Yeah, I'm just mainly curious about this focus on like bike boulevards in particular. Is this necessarily, like in terms of moving forward for policy motivation, is that where you want to expend political capital as opposed to like, dealing with, like more issues of like affordable housing or employment?
Oh, now what we're talking about is the real world.
Well, in terms of the policy statements you're talking about that.
I'm an energy economist. I think the fact that the U.S. government has given up on antitrust on oil companies is a 100% important issue, and bicycles are a bit down the path from there. So no, I agree that there are other social issues I want to apply to. But the fundamental question of that survey data, very exciting stuff, but we have to figure out a way to broaden our response rate. So I think you got a question, didn't you, or didn't you? Okay, yes, you're next.
Jacob Hansen. Did you find a correlation between people being okay with wind during the summer but not during the colder months?
I didn't look. Again, remember the scary problem about specification bias. I actually attempted to be as parsimonious as possible. In part because I knew people would ask me, why didn't you do it 8 different ways? The fact is, every undergraduate statistics course should tell people that they only get 1 visit to the computer per day. And I have reviewed many undergraduate papers that have used stepwise regression, and I've chopped off the enter finger for each undergraduate to do that.
Or just as a comment, all the comments on climate and topography, whether it's good to have them in to control, it's useless for policy purposes. I mean, not even Metro is going to change the climate or the topography of the region.
Well, there's a point, and I agree, but the other point is, when we do planning elsewhere in the economy, we do worry about time, night, holiday, non-holiday, work, non-work uses. And our current data sets so far have been assuming that none of those factors were there. If we have a path that really is only used on weekends, say we'll have a different policy direction than if it's being used for commuters. And I'd like to have enough data to answer that question. By the way, I did take a look at the hourly data on weekends versus weekdays, and it is entirely different. Absolutely different. Weekdays are bimodal, and there is only one maximum. Everyone likes to go recreational bicycling into the red-haired gentleman.
The gentleman has been wanting to ask.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'll take you next.
Thank you. You mentioned that Portland is kind of the best in the land in terms of knowledge, and we always appreciate a little pat on the back. And you also said that the Europeans don't have very much in the way of published studies, but that there are actually more writers there. And then another thing was that our current system favors young over old, male over female, affluent versus non-affluent. And at least to my experience, the reason that Europe has more riders is because they have dedicated bicycle lanes. They have the infrastructure in place. And
I agree with that. That would seem like a very logical hypothesis.
And so in a way, I think that we are the best in the land, but that's kind of, as our former mayor said, high praise on a low standard. What are
the former mayor that way too? But anyway,
what are some of the barriers that you see to us actually developing that kind of infrastructure, or what are some of the solutions? Like, how could we work towards separated, raised bicycle lanes and that type of thing that would kind of level the playing field, have older riders, younger riders, things of that nature?
Okay, now you're asking a city club question. Bear in mind, I have kept this narrow because I don't want to characterize their report as my statistical work. We disagreed on some of these issues. This is a democracy. We're having a political legitimacy issue. As you know, last month the BTA came out with not a very good study on bicycle financing and got slapped down hard. It wasn't a very good study, but the issue it was addressing is critical. We currently have something in the order of between 9 and 11% of downtown employment indicating they're bicycle commuters. This is not a coincidence or a glitch or a one-time event. This is a significant portion of the city's transportation needs. And we need to, in fact, turn that perception of, sort of a privileged minority into a real-life commuter group. And frankly, part of it is, and everyone will now lynch me, is we need to get someone to ante up some money. I don't care actually how much money, a little money. And amazingly enough, some of the real bicycling advocates that we had at the City Club said the same thing. This, in a democracy, politics counts, and we don't have very good politics. And until we fix the politics, we're not going to have the funding. And until we fix the funding, we're not going to have the safe routes that we need. Yeah. And now the red-haired gentleman, sorry about identifying you by your hair color, but now he is a real minority, by the way.
For Dunning-Bridge. John Landau. I can say I can empathize with the difficulty with tracking this kind of data. We track cyclists at OHSU, and trying to figure out what data points affect what is very hard, and we do it in a much less sophisticated manner. That said, I'm curious about a couple of data points that they're taking into account in the predictions, such as terms, in that both PSU and OHSU are two of the biggest biking destinations in downtown. A lot of our riders come over the Hawthorne Bridge, and I know it's hard to tell from here, but it looks like the prediction is a little higher than the actual in the summer, and then come September it reverses. I was wondering if perhaps that is because of people traveling to universities.
Oh, I think you're entirely right. And if you guys would please count yourselves carefully, we'll drop you right into the regression tomorrow. We've, just our data limitations are enormous. The fact that the census doesn't treat university students as commuters is preposterous. And so even our yearly surveys are flat out. And I'd love to find a way to do bicycle counts on the other entries into Portland State. Because let's be blunt, there are 100,000 workers down there, and there are, 15,000 enrolled students in Portland State. Who's that number?
30.
So the bias there is enormous.
There's 5,000 OHSU.
And they're on the top of a hill. They're fierce.
We cheat. We take the tram. So we have a bike though.
So one thing, it's not exactly true that the census doesn't count students, and particularly when you think about the PSU population. A lot of PSU students work, and so if they got the ACS survey and they were asked, how did you get to work last week, they would answer how they got to work. But one question, and it's a fairly minor one, on the regression where you were following Mauricio Leclerc's sort of following up on what he did. You used linear feet of different types of facilities. I think in Mauricio's work he used the density function because census tracts are all different sizes. Did you look at that, or is there a reason you made that decision?
I'll be very blunt. We had a lot of trouble getting good answers from Metro. And the GIS staff there kept saying, well, if you ask that, we'll take another 30 days to answer. And that's fine if you're preparing a scholarly article. Pretty daunting if you're trying to get a city club report out on time. So I didn't actually get as much data that I would like. But my other problem was, again, the specification issue. I had 100 questions, but only 130 data points. And so That's why I would love to get Metro's definition of infrastructure every year, so we can use it against the ACS every year and see if we could get a better data set.
But the density is just feet divided by the area of the census tract. The area of the census tract is available from the census.
I think I needed you to come help me with that. And please, our data set is yours, so if you can think of a better way to do it, no one will be more grateful than I. It's, this really is a busman's holiday for me. And I love data, and I love to learn things, but I'm not actually a OTREC expert. I'm a visiting fireman, so to speak. Yeah. Oh, got it.
Yeah, a lot of times in the past when I listen to this seminar, it's like a lot of the constraint that they've been having is like budget issues, because always it's like, oh, we don't have enough information because of budget issues. But it's like a business, you want to carry your ideas, you want to spread your ideas out to people. You also want to encourage people, but if you don't have a lot of sufficient funds to carry this, how is it going to be accurate? You know, how would the data be accurate? Because I think you have to, the more you put in funds, the more, you know, progression you get. But there's always like budget issues. It's like, well, I don't have interest in that.
Well, you have now talked to someone who has testified on data transparency in both the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate, usually in terms of energy, but it's true of everywhere. Data needs to be free. The marginal cost of providing the data is zero. Metro wanted to charge us $1,000, by the way, for the GIS, which was preposterous. When I was a young man working in Portland General, the senior vice president, I had done a study on our helicopter, and we had a very fancy helicopter so that we could ride around and feel self-important. And they said, well, what is the right price of helicopter riding? And we've noticed that when we divide the cost of the helicopter by the riders, no one will take the helicopter. So he did the right economic study, and he said, the marginal cost of a helicopter ride is very low. It's the fuel cost, effectively. And so then everyone wanted to ride in the helicopter, and they called him up and said, when can we have a second helicopter? Now, the moral of the story is that our data sets, once developed, should be free. They should always be free, because the marginal cost of distribution is zero. That is hard to explain to people. The person I had the lightning bolt at Metro actually wanted our $900. And that was just silly. It's the idea of allocating critical planning data for the city of Portland on the basis of who has a $900 budget. Who did that immediately cut out? Many people in this room, obviously. And not everyone is a 40-year friend of Tom Hughes, who's chairman, so we can call him at home and say, would you please take that person out and rub their nose? So, don't quote me on this, please. You are so right. This is an issue so critical to our society. We are the most sophisticated society on the planet, and our data is just at the edge. We're hanging on with our fingernails all the time. We're distributing a 200-page report on the Whoops 2 nuclear station next week, and we've spent half a year collecting the basic data on one nuclear station. That's the wrong answer. And for bicyclists, we should have 10 times as much data. Sorry, this is a rant, but I really believe in it.
Have you considered utilizing smartphone technology as a mode for collecting data?
Oh, absolutely. You know, the fact is that Google and Verizon have a vast data set which they're developing. It's very, very good. They know where you are. If you use your credit card in Montreal, they will call you and ask you why you are shopping in Montreal. Yesterday you were in Portland. But getting that data from individual companies is hard because they view it as a competitive advantage. And I don't know a solution to that offhand, but you know, Hell, the NSA should help us out.
Quick question. I was thinking,
Sorry, we run out of time, so I think we have to time. So let's thank Robert for a great talk.